When a routine traffic stop turns into a career-defining moment, a police officer's worst assumptions collide with a truth he never saw coming. His target is the man who holds his future in his hands. The sun was starting its descent over the streets of Sacramento, painting the sky with streaks of gold and amber. Eric Porter was on his way home after a long day at the office. His sedan hummed softly as he adjusted the air conditioning, eager to shake off the day's stress. The radio played faintly in the background, a soothing antidote to the bustling city streets. He approached a yellow light, slowing down just as it turned red. That's when the blue and red lights erupted behind him, accompanied by the sharp blare of a police siren. Eric glanced in his rearview mirror, his brows furrowing slightly. He pulled over to the side of the road, rolling down his window as a police cruiser parked behind him. Out stepped Officer Bradley Larson, mid-30s, with a buzz cut and a badge gleaming on his chest. Larson adjusted his belt as he swaggered toward Eric's car, exuding the confidence of someone used to being in control. "License and registration," Larson said curtly, his voice flat but laced with a hint of authority. Eric complied without a word, reaching into his glove compartment for his registration and handing over his driver's license. His movements were deliberate and calm, but he could feel Larson's gaze scrutinizing him, as if searching for a reason to dig deeper. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Larson asked, leaning closer to the window. "I'm not entirely sure," Eric replied evenly, his tone polite but firm. "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," Larson said, though there was a flicker of hesitation in his voice. Eric frowned but nodded slightly. "I see. I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Larson didn't respond immediately. Instead, he lingered, his eyes narrowing as he studied Eric more closely. It wasn't just a routine stop anymore, at least not for Larson. His posture shifted, subtly but noticeably, as if he had already decided this was more than a minor infraction. The officer glanced at the license in his hand. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked. Eric hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." But Larson wasn't really listening. His questions were starting to take on an edge, just enough to suggest that he wasn't concerned about a traffic violation anymore. Eric's calm demeanor seemed to irk him, and he leaned in closer. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" "Just going home," Eric replied. His tone remained steady, but the subtle shift in the air was impossible to ignore. Larson didn't just see Eric as a driver anymore. He saw something else, something that warranted suspicion. Eric could sense the tension building, but he didn't flinch. Little did Officer Larson know the calm exterior wasn't naivety, it was control. This was just the beginning. Larson took a step back, folding Eric's documents with an exaggerated slowness before tucking them into his chest pocket. He straightened up, his expression shifting into something faintly smug, as though he'd already made up his mind about the man sitting in front of him. "Step out of the car for me," Larson ordered. Eric's grip on the steering wheel tightened briefly, but his face betrayed no reaction. "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" he asked, his tone measured. Larson's lips twitched, but he masked it quickly. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The threat hung in the air, unspoken yet unmistakable. Eric exhaled slowly and opened the door. As he stepped out, Larson's eyes flicked over him, sizing him up. Eric stood a little taller than the officer, his shoulders broad, but his demeanor unthreatening. His tailored suit suggested professionalism. His polished shoes hinted at someone meticulous and careful. Yet, none of that seemed to matter. Larson gestured toward the front of the car. "Hands where I can see them." Eric complied, his movements calm and deliberate. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" Larson smirked faintly. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful." Eric turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Larson. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else?" The question landed like a punch, and for a moment Larson's composure faltered. He straightened up, his hand drifting toward his belt, more reflex than necessity. "Watch your tone," he said, his voice hardening. "I'm simply asking a question. Eric replied. There was no defiance in his voice, just a quiet firmness that seemed to unsettle the officer. Larson leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. You seem awfully familiar with how this works. You got something to hide? Eric let the silence stretch for a beat before answering. No, officer. I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency, you know. Larson scoffed, but didn't reply. He stepped back, pacing a small circle in front of the car. The dynamic was shifting in ways he couldn't quite grasp. Eric wasn't reacting the way most people would. There was no fear, no stammering, no nervous fidgeting. Instead, there was control, poise, and an unsettling calm that put Larson on edge. You seem pretty confident, Larson muttered, almost to himself. Like you think you know what's going to happen next. Eric didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is. Larson froze for half a second, before turning back to face him. The smirk was gone now, replaced by something sharper, almost defensive. He opened his mouth to reply, but the words didn't come out. Eric's composure was throwing him off balance, and he didn't like it. As the silence stretched, the tension between them felt electric, and Larson was starting to realize this wasn't going to play out the way he'd expected. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. The real test was about to begin. Larson tapped his fingers against the holster on his belt, his frustration barely concealed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who looked like Eric. His gaze flicked back to the sedan, as though searching for a justification he hadn't yet manufactured. Turn around and place your hands on the hood, Larson said, his voice clipped. I need to check for weapons. Eric raised an eyebrow. Weapons? He repeated, his tone incredulous but still measured. Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon? Larson's jaw tightened, and for a moment his composure cracked. I'm not going to ask you again. Eric hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face. Then, without a word, he turned and placed his palms flat against the hood of his car. Larson approached, the crunch of his boots on the asphalt breaking the uneasy silence. The officer patted Eric down in quick, rough movements, his hands lingering a little longer than necessary. It wasn't just a search. It was an attempt to assert dominance, to provoke a reaction. But Eric didn't flinch, didn't stiffen, didn't so much as shift under the invasive scrutiny. You're clean, Larson muttered, stepping back. The admission sounded begrudging, like he was irritated that he hadn't found anything to justify his suspicion. Eric turned to face him, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. Of course I am, he said simply. Now, officer, if you're done. I'm not done, Larson interrupted, his voice rising slightly. The words tumbled out too quickly, betraying his need to stay in control. You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why? Eric folded his arms, his posture relaxed despite the tension crackling between them. I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement, he said. Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years. Larson's eyes narrowed. That's so. You a lawyer or something? Eric smiled faintly. Or something. The ambiguity in his answer seemed to irritate Larson further. He stepped closer, invading Eric's personal space, his voice dropping to a near growl. Listen. You think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this? Eric met his gaze evenly, unflinching. I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And so far I'm not seeing much of it here. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Larson took the bait. Fairness? You think fairness is what this is about? People like you always? He stopped himself abruptly, the words lingering like smoke even though they hadn't fully escaped. Eric's expression didn't change, but something about his posture shifted, a subtle but unmistakable signal that he'd caught exactly what Larson had left unsaid. People like me, Eric repeated, his voice soft but charged with meaning. Larson bristled, stepping back as if realizing he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. You know what I mean, he muttered, though his tone lacked the conviction it had moments earlier. "I think I do," Eric replied quietly. His calmness wasn't passive anymore. It was razor-sharp, cutting through the pretense like a blade. "And I think we both know this interaction stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago." Larson opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. For the first time he looked uncertain, like he wasn't entirely sure how to proceed. The balance of power was shifting, and for the first time, Larson was on shaky ground. But the moment of reckoning was still to come, and it would be one he'd never forget. Eric's voice broke the heavy silence, steady and unyielding. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Larson's brows knitted, his irritation resurfacing. "I don't care who you are," he shot back, though the faint crack in his tone suggested otherwise. Eric reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm reaching for my badge," he said calmly, watching Larson's hand twitch near his holster. "No need for theatrics. I want you to see it." The words hung in the air, weighted with something unspoken. Larson's eyes followed Eric's hand as he pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. "Eric Porter," Eric said, his tone as casual as if he were introducing himself to a neighbor. "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." Larson froze. His eyes darted to the badge, then back to Eric's face, searching for some sign that this was a joke. But there was no humor in Eric's expression, only quiet authority and a hint of disappointment. "Internal Affairs?" Larson repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "You're—" "Yes," Eric interrupted, saving him the trouble of finishing the thought. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the people wearing this badge uphold the integrity and values it's meant to represent." Larson's face paled, his confident demeanor unraveling in real time. He took a small step back, his hand falling away from his belt, as though the weight of his own authority had suddenly become too heavy. Eric took a step forward, closing the gap Larson had instinctively created. "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Larson?" he asked, his voice calm but piercing. Larson didn't answer. He looked like a man who had just realized he'd walked into quicksand and had no idea how to escape. "It's not the profiling," Eric continued, "though that's bad enough. It's not the baseless escalation either. It's the fact that you've done all of this without even realizing who you were talking to. You assumed that I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold. And why?" Larson opened his mouth, but no words came. Eric's gaze bore into him, unrelenting. "Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect," Eric finished for him. His words weren't angry, but they carried the weight of an indictment. "And that's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for everyone you encounter in this uniform." Larson's shoulders sagged slightly, the full weight of Eric's words landing squarely on him. He glanced down at the badge in Eric's hand again, as if it might somehow disappear if he didn't look too closely. Eric stepped back, giving Larson a moment to breathe, but his voice didn't lose its edge. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next." Larson's lips parted, but he hesitated, clearly debating whether to push back or comply. The hesitation cost him. "And then," Eric added, his voice lowering slightly, "you're going to hear from me again. Not as a driver you stopped on the side of the road, but as the man tasked with deciding whether you're fit to wear that badge." Larson swallowed hard, his face reddening as the weight of the moment sank in. He reached into his chest pocket and pulled out Eric's license and registration, his hands trembling slightly as he handed them over. Eric took them without a word, tucking them into his wallet. He stepped toward the driver's side door of his car, pausing with one hand on the handle. He looked over his shoulder, meeting Larson's gaze one last time. "Remember this, Officer Larson," Eric said. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." As Eric slid back into his car and started the engine, Larson was left standing in the fading light, his confidence shaken and his future uncertain. But for Eric, this was far from over. His next move would ripple through the entire department. The drive home was quiet, but Eric's mind was anything but. The encounter played over in his head, not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. Larson wasn't the first officer Eric had dealt with like this, and he knew he wouldn't be the last. But this time, things would be different. This time, Eric had the authority to act. The next morning, Eric sat at his desk, the early sunlight streaming through the blinds of his office at the Sacramento Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. A file sat open in front of him. Officer Bradley Larson. His record wasn't spotless. Minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, and vague misunderstandings that had never been properly addressed. Eric leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he thought about the broader implications. Larson wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a deeper problem, and Eric wasn't interested in putting a bandage on a bullet wound. A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant Linda stepped in, holding a stack of reports. "Morning, Mr. Porter. I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Daniels wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Eric nodded, taking the files from her. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." Linda hesitated, sensing the weight in Eric's tone. "Of course," she said, before slipping out of the room. Eric turned his attention back to Larson's file, but his focus wasn't just on the officer. This was bigger than one man and one interaction. It was about the culture that allowed someone like Larson to feel justified in his behavior. And if there was one thing Eric knew, it was that culture started at the top. Later that afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in a conference room. Daniels, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned back in his chair, listening intently as Eric recounted the traffic stop. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Eric said, his voice steady but resolute. "But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Daniels rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly. "This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up," he admitted. "But we've always handled it internally. Quietly." "And that's the problem," Eric replied. "Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. It's time to be loud." Daniels looked at him. The weight of the conversation etched into his face. "What are you proposing?" "A department-wide review," Eric said without hesitation. "Not just of individual officers, but of our training, our protocols, our accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Daniels leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this." "Good," Eric said simply. "It's about time someone did." The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and reports. Eric worked tirelessly, compiling data, speaking with officers, and holding public forums to hear directly from the community. The Larson incident became a catalyst for change, a turning point that forced the department to confront its flaws head-on. Larson, for his part, faced an internal hearing. Eric made no secret of his involvement, sitting across from Larson during the proceedings and watching as the officer squirmed under the scrutiny. The hearing resulted in a suspension, but Eric knew the real victory wasn't in punishing Larson. It was in preventing the next Larson. Months later, Eric stood at the podium of a community event, addressing a room full of officers, city officials, and local residents. He spoke not of blame, but of responsibility, of the shared duty to create a system that worked for everyone. His words weren't just a call for accountability. They were a promise of change. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," Eric said, his voice resonating through the hall. "It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter. That's the badge I believe in, and that's the badge we're building here, together." The applause was thunderous, but Eric didn't linger on it. For him, this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a better one. As Eric stepped down from the podium, he glanced at the faces in the crowd, some skeptical, some hopeful, but all listening. He knew change wouldn't come overnight, but it would come. And for now, that was enough. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's start the conversations that matter, the ones that lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, stories that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we're capable of when we stand for what's right.